Today we're going to talk a little about shell shock, the common World War I name for a psychological injury we now usually call PTSD. Before we begin, we should note that shell shock was a controversial term even during the Great War. Doctors preferred to call it war neurosis or some similar term. But the term shell shock was evocative in a war where the number one cause of death was shelling by ubiquitous artillery. Shell shock is not a new disorder at all. If we think about it as post-traumatic stress, we would recognize that as long as people have been enduring trauma, there has been some version of shell shock. The ancient Greek poet Homer recorded something that looks like shell shock in the Iliad and the Odyssey. In the American Civil War, the ailment was well known and was called soldier's heart. What was different about shell shock in World War I was how common it was compared to other wars. Up to 1 in 10 frontline officers, the officers who lived in the trenches with the men and who led them over the top, succumbed to shell shock, and a slightly lower rate, though of course higher absolute number, of enlisted men suffered as well. In the early days of the war, the military declared that the symptoms were just malingering, a sign of cowardice, and soldiers suffering from shell shock were shot by firing squad. But this became unsustainable for the Army as the numbers of soldiers with the disorder increased. Showalter suggests in her essay, which you will read in this module, that shell shock rates increase with soldiers' immobility. It was certainly true that the highest rate of shell shock was among balloon observers, who went aloft in the basket of a balloon tethered to the ground and in easy shooting of the enemy. And the lowest rates were among pilots who could maneuver their airplanes away from enemy gunfire, as well as practicing active warfare themselves. For the first time in war, soldiers in the Great War faced a wholly static situation in which they and the enemy were both entrenched with no clear or even plausible way to bring movement to the war. Showalter links shell shock, a condition of soldiers fighting trench warfare, with hysteria, a condition of middle and upper middle class women in the Victorian era, whose movements and possibilities were confined, but who had to put a smiling face on their lack of self-direction. Hysteria, she argues, was a response to the confining conditions of middle-class female life. Although these women were in gilded cages, they were still caged, and with no possibility of expressing their feelings, their emotional repression expressed itself in the physical symptoms of hysteria. This condition, which created physical symptoms in the body that were beyond the control of sufferers, freed them from the necessity to keep up a brave face. It was usually treated with disciplinary treatments, such as confinement in a dark room in a nursing home in the country for 6 weeks or more. During that time, patients would be forbidden to read or write, could have no visitors, and were forced to drink quantities of milk, a solid diet being considered too exciting for their systems. They were allowed out of this imprisonment when they gave up their symptoms. We should recognize that this kind of solitary confinement with sensory deprivation would now be considered torture. It creates many of the same symptoms it was designed to cure. During World War I, so many soldiers had these symptoms that a wholesale change in psychological treatment began. Military doctors first recognized that large numbers of soldiers were displaying symptoms equivalent to hysteria, which had before been a disease only of women. Doctors recognized that the treatment of solitary confinement didn't work, and that they needed better ways of treating soldiers. Showalter focuses on the work of W.H.R. Rivers, a doctor who had studied psychology, but who was also an anthropologist. Rivers had read Freud and suspected that Freud's talking treatment might be better for his patients than confinement. Like most English people, he dismissed Freud's idea that repression is all about sex and theorized that one might well want to repress traumatic experiences and might do it consciously as well as unconsciously. Rivers's most famous patient was Siegfried Sassoon, who was sent to Craig Lockhart War Hospital in 1917, not for treatment of shell shock, but because he had written a declaration against the war. Sassoon was too famous and well-connected to court-martial for this, so the military declared him not responsible for his actions due to mental stress and sent him off to Rivers for treatment. While Sassoon was at Craig Lockhart, Rivers encouraged him to continue writing poetry because Rivers firmly believed that repressing one's experiences of the war was responsible for a lot of the symptoms he was seeing. He wrote the lecture Repression of War Experience, which you will read in this module, to articulate for fellow doctors the role he thought repression had in creating shell shock symptoms. He and Sassoon were friendly, something other than the standard doctor-patient relationship, since he wasn't really treating Sassoon for mental illness, but just trying to persuade him to give up his protest and return to the war. Sassoon was engaged in trying to write a poem about what shell shock feels like, and Rivers shared with him his lecture, after which Sassoon retitled his poem to match Rivers's title. For Rivers, as you will see in his lecture, the first line of treatment for shell-shocked soldiers was to get them to articulate, to narrate their experiences. Rivers's therapeutic strategy is very similar to how we treat PTSD today. In fact, with the exception of drugs that have been developed in the last century, much of the standard treatment for PTSD is connected to discoveries made during the Great War. Doctors on the front lines in World War I discovered that the sooner you could get someone talking about their traumatic experiences, the less likely they were to develop shell shock. It's standard practice now that when a military unit is deployed in any combat zone, they are immediately debriefed upon returning from the mission, even if nothing really happened. Rivers's insight that avoiding repression and embracing narration of one's trauma lay at the heart of shell shock treatment and remains standard practice today.